14 years. She was never mine.
The phone call that destroyed my life came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right when I was finally drifting off after another 14-hour day of fixing other people's broken homes. Ironic, considering I couldn't fix my own. Harlan Renovations. Dean speaking, I mumbled into Julia's phone, which had been buzzing on her nightstand while she showered. You left your underwear here again? The voice was low, intimate, familiar in a way that made my blood freeze. The red ones with the little bow. My brother Mark's voice, talking about my wife's underwear. I should have hung up, should have pretended I never heard it. Instead, I stayed silent, paralyzed by the casual closeness in his tone. Julia? Baby, you there? Mark's voice got softer, more tender than I'd heard him speak to anyone in years. I love you so damn much it scares me sometimes. I ended the call with shaking fingers and stared at the ceiling of our Austin suburban bedroom. Outside, sprinklers hissed across manicured lawns, and somewhere a dog barked at shadows. Normal sounds of a normal life that had just revealed itself to be a complete lie. Julia emerged from the bathroom in a cloud of vanilla-scented steam, toweling her dark hair. At 36, she still turned heads at the corporate events she planned, all sharp cheekbones and calculated smiles. She'd been turning Mark's head, apparently. Who called? She asked, not quite meeting my eyes. Wrong number, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Some guy looking for his girlfriend's underwear. She went very still for just a moment, a pause so brief I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching for it. Then she laughed, that practiced tinkle she used with difficult clients. Perverts, she said, climbing into bed. You should have hung up immediately. I should have done a lot of things immediately, like confronted her, like called Mark and demanded answers, like thrown her cheating A out of the house I'd spent 3 years renovating with my own hands. Instead, I lay there in the dark, listening to her breathe, and let 20 years of marriage dissolve into the kind of bitter clarity that only comes at 3 a.m. when your world falls apart. My name is Dean Harlan, and I've spent my entire adult life building things. Houses, businesses, a family, a reputation in Austin's competitive renovation market. I started with nothing, literally nothing, aging out of foster care at 18 with a pickup truck and a toolbox my last foster dad gave me out of pity. Now I employ 12 guys, own a warehouse full of equipment, and have a waiting list of clients who want Dean Harlan to transform their disasters into dreams. I'm good at fixing what's broken, except apparently my own life. The next morning arrived with Texas heat and the smell of Julia's expensive coffee. She stood at the kitchen island in her power suit, scrolling through her phone with the focused intensity she usually reserved for seating charts and catering disasters. Late meeting tonight, she said, without looking up. The Pemberton anniversary party. You know how demanding they are. I knew. I'd renovated their kitchen 2 years ago while Julia planned their silver anniversary bash. Demanding didn't begin to cover it. What time will you be home? I asked, buttering toast with mechanical precision. Probably midnight, maybe later. You know how these events run? I did know. I also knew that Mark had mentioned being back in town this week after his latest deployment. Captain Mark Harlan, the golden boy of the family with his medals and his charm, and apparently my wife's red underwear. Emma wandered into the kitchen, 14 and perpetually annoyed with the world. Her dark hair, Julia's hair, hung in her face as she grabbed a granola bar from the pantry. Can I stay at Madison's Friday night? She asked, not looking at either of us. School night, Julia said automatically. It's Saturday, Mom. God, you don't even listen. Julia's jaw tightened. Don't take that tone with me, Emma. What tone? The tone where I actually want to have a social life instead of sitting around here watching you and Dad pretend to like each other? The granola bar wrapper crinkled in the sudden silence. Emma had always been too smart for her own good, too observant. She got that from me, unfortunately. Your father and I are fine, Julia said, but her voice had that brittle quality it got when she was lying. Emma snorted. Sure you are. That's why Dad sleeps in the guest room half the time and you're never home. Emma! My voice came out sharper than I intended. Enough! She looked at me with eyes that were too knowing for 14. Whatever. Can I stay at Madison's or not? Ask your mother, I said, standing up. I've got to get to work. I kissed Julia's cheek on autopilot, tasting her expensive moisturizer and the lies she'd told me about working late. She smelled like guilt and secrets. The job site that day was a 1920s bungalow in South Austin, the kind of place that looked charming from the street, but revealed decades of amateur repairs once you started opening walls. Like a marriage, I thought, watching my crew tear out water-damaged drywall. My phone buzzed around noon. Troy LeDuc, my best friend since high school and the only person who knew about my foster kid background without treating me like a charity case. Beer tonight? His text read. Got some interesting stories from my latest case. Troy had been a cop for 15 years before burning out and going private. Now he spent his time catching cheating spouses and tracking down deadbeat dads. The irony wasn't lost on me. Can't, I texted back. Family dinner at the parents'. 3 dots appeared, then, my condolences. The Harlan family dinners happened every other Sunday at my parents' house in Westlake, where they'd lived since Mark and I were kids. Hank and Marlene Harlan had worked their way up from middle class to comfortable, and they never let anyone forget it. Especially me. I'd been the difficult child, the one who asked too many questions and never quite fit their vision of success. Mark had been the golden boy from birth. Handsome, athletic, charming, everything I wasn't. The fact that I'd built a successful business from nothing while Mark bounced from one military assignment to another didn't seem to matter. He had a uniform and medals. I had calloused hands and a reputation for quality work. Julia was already at the house when I arrived, laughing at something my mother had said while she arranged flowers in the dining room. She'd changed from her work clothes into a sundress that showed off her figure, and I wondered if she'd chosen it for Mark. Dean, my father's voice boomed from his leather chair in the living room. How's business? Good, I said, accepting his handshake. Booked through Christmas. That's wonderful, honey, my mother said, not looking up from her flowers. Mark should be here soon. He just got back from overseas. Of course he did. Mark's timing had always been perfect. He arrived 20 minutes later in his dress uniform, all sharp creases and polished brass. At 33, he still looked like the high school quarterback he'd been, broad shoulders and easy smile that made people trust him instantly. Dean. He grabbed me in one of his bone-crushing hugs, and I caught a whiff of the same cologne Julia sometimes smelled like when she came home from her late meetings. Mark. I managed to keep my voice neutral. How was deployment? Classified, he said with a grin, then winked at Julia. But I'm glad to be back among friendly faces. Julia blushed. Actually blushed, like a teenager with a crush. Dinner was the usual performance. Mark regaled us with carefully edited stories from his latest assignment while my parents hung on every word. Julia laughed at all the right moments, her hand gesturing as she talked, and I noticed she'd painted her nails the same shade of red as the underwear Mark had mentioned on the phone. Dean's been working on the Morrison house, Julia said during a lull in Mark's stories. You should see it, Mark. He's completely transformed the place. I'm sure he has, Mark said, but his attention was focused on Julia's mouth as she spoke. Dean's always been good with his hands. The double meaning hung in the air like smoke. My mother beamed at what she heard as a compliment. My father nodded approvingly. Julia's cheeks flushed pink. I wanted to flip the table over. Instead, I took another bite of my mother's pot roast and wondered how long they'd been playing this game right in front of me. How are the girls? Mark asked, turning to Julia with the kind of focused attention he used to give his high school girlfriends. Emma's going through her rebellious phase, Julia said with a laugh. 14, you know how it is. And Zoe's doing well in school. She's so artistic, just like you were at that age, Mark. I'd love to see them, Mark said. Maybe I could take them to the zoo this weekend. Give you and Dean a break. That's so thoughtful, my mother chimed in. Mark, you're going to make such a wonderful father someday. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. I looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw something I'd been too blind to notice before. The shape of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the same expressions I saw on Emma's face every day. My fork clattered against my plate. You okay, honey? Julia asked, her voice carefully concerned. Fine, I managed. Just tired, long day. But I wasn't fine. I was drowning in the middle of my parents' dining room, surrounded by people who were supposed to love me, and realizing that everything I'd built my life on was a lie. After dinner, Mark cornered me in the kitchen while I helped clear dishes. You look stressed, brother, he said, his voice carrying that fake concern he'd perfected over the years. Everything okay at home? I turned to face him. This man who'd shared my childhood and apparently my wife. Everything's perfect, Mark. Just like always. He studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or calculation. Good, he said finally. Because family is everything, Dean. We have to stick together. Family. The word tasted like ashes in my mouth. I drove home in silence, my mind racing through 20 years of marriage, looking for signs I'd missed. Julia's sudden interest in fitness when Mark got stationed in Austin 3 years ago, the way she'd started working late more often, the new lingerie I'd found in her drawer, tags still on, that she'd never worn for me. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Julia's car was gone. Another late meeting, another lie. I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the home I'd renovated with my own hands, and wondered if anything in my life was actually mine. I called Troy at 7 the next morning, before I could lose my nerve. "I need a favor," I said when he answered on the second ring. "Jesus, Dean, it's barely dawn. This better be good. I think Julia's cheating on me." Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of 20 years of friendship and everything Troy knew about my marriage without ever saying it out loud. "You think or you know?" he asked finally. "I know." The words came out steadier than I felt. "I need proof." Proof for what? Divorce? I hadn't thought that far ahead. All I knew was that I needed to see the truth laid out in black and white, needed to stop living in the shadow of my own suspicions. "Just proof," I said. "Can you help me or not?" Troy sighed. "Meet me at my office at noon. And Dean, don't do anything stupid before then." The morning dragged by in a haze of work orders and supply deliveries. I found myself staring at my phone, wondering if I should confront Julia directly. But every time I started to dial her number, I remembered Mark's voice on the phone, the casual closeness of it, and my finger would freeze over the screen. Troy's office sat above a bail bondsman in a strip mall off I-35, the kind of place that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. He'd been there 5 years, ever since he'd quit the force after his partner was eliminated in a domestic violence call gone wrong. "You look like hell," he said when I walked in. "So feel worse?" I dropped into the chair across from his desk, noting the stack of case files and the half-empty bottle of antacids next to his computer. "How bad is this going to be?" "Depends on what you really want to know." Troy leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same intensity he'd once used on suspects. "Nizam, sometimes the truth is worse than the suspicion." "It's my brother," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I think she's sleeping with Mark." Troy's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "What makes you think that?" I told him about the phone call, about dinner at my parents', about all the little signs I'd been ignoring for months. Troy listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "I'll need to follow her," he said when I finished. "Get photos, documentation. It'll take a few days, maybe a week." "How much?" "For you? Just expenses." He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the parking lot. "Dean, I have to ask, what are you planning to do with this information?" "I don't know yet." "Because if you're thinking about confronting them, you need to be smart about it. Emotional decisions lead to stupid mistakes." I thought about Mark's easy smile, about Julia's lies, about my parents' obvious favoritism. Maybe it's time I made some stupid mistakes. "Don't." Troy turned back to me, his expression serious. "Whatever you do, don't give them ammunition to use against you, especially if kids are involved." Kids. Emma and Zoe, who might not even be mine. The thought made my stomach clench. "There's something else," I said. "I think Emma might be Mark's daughter." Troy sat back down heavily. "Crap, Dean. She looks like him, acts like him, and the timing." I rubbed my face with both hands. "Julia and I went through a rough patch about 15 years ago. Mark was home on leave. You want a paternity test? Can you arrange it? Yeah, but it's not cheap. And if you're right, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to." I left Troy's office with a plan and a sick feeling in my stomach. The plan was simple. Let Troy gather evidence while I acted normal, pretended everything was fine. The sick feeling was harder to shake. Julia was home when I got there, standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of wine and her laptop open. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt maybe, or fear. "How was work?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Fine. You?" "Busy. The Henderson wedding is this weekend, and they keep changing their minds about everything." She took a sip of wine, and I noticed her hand was shaking slightly. "How was dinner at your parents'?" "You were there." "I meant after I left. You and Mark seemed to be having an intense conversation in the kitchen." So she'd been watching. Interesting. "Just catching up," I said, opening the refrigerator and grabbing a beer. "He asked about the girls." He's always been good with them. Her voice was wistful, almost dreamy. Remember when Emma was little and he'd visit? She adored him. Yeah, I said, twisting off the bottle cap with more force than necessary. I remember. The next few days passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I went to work, came home, had dinner with Julia and the girls, and pretended everything was normal. But underneath the surface, I was watching everything with new eyes. I noticed how Julia's phone was always face down on the table during dinner, how she'd started taking calls in the other room, how she'd suddenly developed an interest in military news, always knowing when Mark's unit was mentioned in the papers. I noticed how Emma had Mark's stubborn streak, his way of tilting her head when she was thinking, how Zoe had his artistic talents, the same ones my mother had gushed about at dinner. I noticed how my own daughters looked nothing like me. Troy called on Thursday morning with an update. I've got photos, he said without preamble. You want to see them now or wait until I have everything? Now. We met at a diner near the lake, the kind of place where truckers and construction workers grabbed coffee before dawn. Troy slid a manila envelope across the table, his expression grim. Fair warning, he said. This is going to hurt. The photos were professionally shot, crystal clear, and devastating. Julia and Mark at a hotel bar, her hand on his thigh. Julia and Mark kissing in the parking lot of a restaurant I'd never heard of. Julia and Mark entering a room at the Dries Limonat Hotel, her overnight bag slung over his shoulder. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Based on what I've seen, at least 6 months, probably longer. They're not trying very hard to hide it. I stared at a photo of my wife and my brother sharing what looked like an intimate joke, both of them laughing like teenagers. What about the paternity test? Troy pulled out another envelope, smaller than the first. I got hair samples from Emma's brush when you had me check the house security. The lab rushed it. I already knew what the results would say before I opened the envelope. Emma was Mark's daughter. Zoe's test was still pending, but I had a feeling I knew what that would show too. I'm sorry, Dean, Troy said quietly. I sat there in the diner, surrounded by the sounds of normal people living normal lives, and felt the last pieces of my world crumble. My wife was cheating with my brother. My daughters weren't mine. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of believing in something that had never existed. What now? Troy asked. I looked at the photos again, at the evidence of betrayal laid out in black and white. Julia looked happy in every shot, happier than she'd looked with me in years. Mark looked like a man in love, all soft smiles and protective gestures. Now, I said, sliding the photos back into the envelope. I figure out how to make them pay. But first I had to go home and pretend everything was still normal. I had to kiss my cheating wife and help my brother's daughters with their homework and act like my heart wasn't broken into 1,000 pieces. I had to be smart about this, patient, because Troy was right. Emotional decisions led to stupid mistakes, and I'd already made enough of those to last a lifetime. The question was, how do you destroy someone's life without destroying your own in the process? I was about to find out. The plan started simple. Document everything, stay calm, and wait for the right moment to strike. But life has a way of forcing your hand when you're least prepared for it. It happened on a Saturday morning while I was replacing the garbage disposal. Julia had gone to her yoga class, or so she said, and the girls were still asleep. I was elbow deep in plumbing when Emma wandered into the kitchen in her pajamas. Dad, she said, her voice unusually small. Can I ask you something? Sure, sweetheart. I wiped my hands on a towel and gave her my full attention. Emma rarely asked for anything, especially not in that tentative tone. Do you think Mom loves us? The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course she does. Why would you ask that? Emma shrugged, suddenly fascinated with the pattern on the kitchen tiles. She's just different lately, always on her phone, always going out. And when she is here, it's like she's thinking about somewhere else. I wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that her mother was just going through a stressful time at work. But looking at Emma's face, I saw too much of my own pain reflected there. Sometimes adults go through difficult periods, I said carefully. It doesn't mean she doesn't love you. But she doesn't love you anymore, does she? The directness of it took my breath away. Emma had always been perceptive, but this was beyond her years. What makes you say that? I'm not stupid, Dad. You guys barely talk to each other. You sleep in the guest room half the time. And Uncle Mark. She trailed off, but the look in her eyes told me she'd seen more than she should have. What about Uncle Mark? Nothing. Just, He's around a lot more now. And Mom gets all weird when he's here. Happy weird, but weird. I sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for Emma to join me. She was 14, old enough to handle some truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Your mom and I are having some problems, I admitted, but that has nothing to do with how much we both love you and Zoe. Are you getting divorced? The question I'd been avoiding, spoken with the brutal honesty only teenagers could manage. I don't know, I said. Maybe. Emma nodded like she'd been expecting that answer. Will we stay with you or her? We'll figure it out. But no matter what happens, you'll always be my daughter, okay? She smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. Okay, Dad. After she went back upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen and realized that my plan to wait and document everything was falling apart. Emma was already being hurt by this situation. Zoe would be next. Whatever I was going to do, I needed to do it soon. Julia came home from yoga, glowing and relaxed. Her hair slightly mussed in a way that had nothing to do with downward dog poses. She kissed my cheek absently and headed straight for the shower. While the water ran, I checked her phone. I'd never been the kind of husband who snooped through his wife's messages, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Her password was Emma's birthday. Ironic, considering Emma wasn't even mine. The text thread with Mark was right there at the top of her messages, dozens of exchanges that made my stomach turn. The most recent was from an hour ago. Mark, God, I can still taste you. When can I see you again? Julia, tonight. Dean's going to Troy's to watch the game. Mark, my place or hotel? Julia, your place, I'll bring wine. I wasn't going to Troy's to watch any game, but apparently that was the lie Julia had planned to tell me. I scrolled up through their conversation, reading months of intimate messages, plans to meet, declarations of love that should have been directed at me. One message from 3 weeks ago stopped me cold. Julia, I wish we could just run away together. Take the girls and start over somewhere new. Mark, maybe we can. I'm thinking about getting out of the army. We could go anywhere. Julia, what about Dean? Mark, what about him? He'll survive. He always does. The casual dismissal of my existence, of 20 years of marriage, was almost worse than the betrayal itself. I was just an obstacle to be worked around, a problem to be solved. I screenshotted everything and sent the images to my own phone, then deleted the evidence from Julia's message history. By the time she came out of the shower, I was back at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. I'm going out tonight, she said, toweling her hair. Girls' night with Sienna and the gang. Have fun, I said without looking up from the sports section. Instead of going to Troy's, I drove to Mark's apartment complex and parked where I could see his building. Julia arrived at 8:30 with a bottle of wine and an overnight bag. She looked around nervously before hurrying inside, but she didn't see me sitting in the shadows. I called Troy. Change of plans, I said when he answered. I want to confront them tonight. Dean, no, we talked about this. You need to be smart. I am being smart. They're planning to run away together. Take my girls and disappear. I can't let that happen. What girls? Dean, if they're not biologically yours. They're mine, I said fiercely. I've raised them for 14 and 10 years. I've been to every school play, every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference. Biology doesn't change that. Troy was quiet for a long moment. What do you want to do? I want to end this. Tonight. But I need backup. I'll be there in 20 minutes. While I waited for Troy, I sat in my truck and thought about the last 20 years. Meeting Julia in college, thinking I'd found my person. The wedding my parents had paid for, where Mark had been my best man. Emma's birth, when I'd cried holding her for the first time. Zoe's first steps, her first word, which had been Dada, directed at me. All of it built on lies. But that didn't make the love any less real. At least not on my side. Troy arrived in his beat-up Crown Vic, parking next to my truck. He got out and leaned against my driver's side door. You sure about this? He asked. I'm sure about ending it. The how is still up for debate. What's the goal here? Scare them? Get Julia to come home? Public humiliation? I thought about Emma's question that morning, about whether Julia still loved us, about the text messages and the casual way they discussed discarding me, about 20 years of being the responsible one, the steady one, the one who fixed everyone else's problems while they lived their lives without consequences. All of the above, I said. We walked into Mark's building like we belonged there. Troy had taught me a few things over the years about looking official, about carrying yourself with the kind of authority that made people assume you had a right to be wherever you were. Mark's apartment was on the 3rd floor. I could hear music playing softly through the door, and the sound of Julia's laugh, the real one, not the polite version she used with clients. I knocked. The music stopped. Footsteps approached the door, and I heard Mark's voice. "Who is it?" "Building management," Troy called out in his best official voice. "We've had reports of a water leak from this unit." The door opened, and Mark appeared in a bathrobe, his hair mussed and his face flushed. Behind him, I could see Julia on the couch, wrapped in a sheet and looking like she'd just been thoroughly satisfied. The expression on Mark's face when he saw me was almost worth the months of lies and betrayal. Almost. "Dean," he said, his voice strangled. "What are you—" I pushed past him into the apartment, Troy close behind me. Julia scrambled to cover herself better, her face cycling through shock, fear, and something that might have been relief. "Having a nice girls' night?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "Dean, I can explain," Julia started. "Can you?" "Because I'd love to hear the explanation for how girls' night involves my brother's bathrobe on the floor and wine glasses for two." Mark stepped forward, and I could see him switching into his military bearing, trying to take control of the situation. "Look, this isn't how we wanted you to find out." "How long?" I asked, cutting him off. They looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that couples develop over time. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 years, Julia said quietly. 2 years. Not 6 months like Troy had estimated. 2 years of lies, of pretending to be happy, of sleeping next to someone who was planning to leave me for my own brother. "The girls," I said. "Are they mine?" Another look passed between them, and I saw Mark's jaw tighten. "Dean," Julia started. "Are they mine?" "Emma is Mark's," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Zoe, we're not sure." The room spun slightly, and I felt Troy's hand on my shoulder steadying me. Emma, my brilliant, stubborn, beautiful daughter, wasn't mine. And Zoe, my baby, might not be either. "You son of a witch," I said, turning to Mark. "You couldn't just take my wife. You had to take my children, too." "They were never really yours," Mark said, and there was something almost pitying in his voice. "Julia and we have something real, something you never gave her." What I never gave her? The anger was building now, hot and clean and focused. "I gave her everything. A home, a family, 20 years of my life." "A boring, predictable life," Mark interrupted. "When was the last time you surprised her? When was the last time you made her feel alive?" I looked at Julia, waiting for her to defend me, to say something about the life we'd built together. Instead, she just sat there wrapped in her sheet, looking like she wanted to disappear. "So, this is how it ends," I said. 20 years of marriage, and you don't even have the guts to look me in the eye." Julia finally met my gaze, and what I saw there was worse than guilt or shame. It was relief. Relief that she didn't have to pretend anymore. "I'm sorry, Dean," she said. "I never meant for it to happen this way. But you're not sorry it happened." She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "I'm not." The honesty of it was like a slap in the face, but it was also liberating in a strange way. No more wondering, no more hoping things would get better. Just the truth, ugly and final. "Well," I said, looking around the apartment that had become the scene of my marriage's end. "I guess that settles it." I turned to leave, but Mark's voice stopped me. "Dean, wait, we need to talk about the girls, about custody and—" I spun around, and whatever Mark saw in my face made him take a step back. "You want to talk about my daughters?" I said, my voice deadly quiet. "The ones I've raised since birth, the ones who call me dad? Biologically, you're a seed donor. I'm their father. And if you think I'm going to let you waltz in and play happy family with them after destroying their home, you're even more delusional than I thought." "Dean, be reasonable," Julia started. "Reasonable?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've been reasonable for 20 years. I've been understanding and patient and supportive while you two have been sneaking around behind my back. I'm done being reasonable." I headed for the door again, Troy following. "This isn't over," Mark called after me. I stopped in the doorway and turned back one last time. "You're right," I said. "It's not over. It's just getting started." The war began the next morning with a phone call from my lawyer and ended 3 months later with Mark's career in ruins and Julia's reputation in ashes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I had to tell the girls. Emma took it better than I expected. She was old enough to have sensed the tension, smart enough to piece together the implications of what I was telling her. When I explained that she was biologically Mark's daughter, but that nothing would change between us, she just nodded. I figured, she said quietly. I look like him. You look like yourself, I corrected. And you're my daughter no matter what any DNA test says. Zoe was harder. At 10, she didn't understand why Mommy had moved out, why Uncle Mark wasn't coming around anymore, why everything felt different. I did my best to explain without destroying her image of her mother, but there's only so much you can sanitize when your world is falling apart. The custody battle was vicious. Julia's lawyer painted me as a controlling husband who had driven his wife into another man's arms. My lawyer, a shark named Patricia Vance who specialized in high-conflict divorces, painted Julia as an unfaithful wife who had abandoned her children for her brother-in-law. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in the middle, but Patricia was very good at her job. We're going to destroy them, she told me during our first meeting. Infidelity, abandonment, emotional distress. By the time we're done, Julia will be lucky to get supervised visitation. What about Mark? Patricia smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Leave Captain America to me. She started with Mark's commanding officer. Infidelity was still a crime under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and Patricia made sure the Army knew exactly what their golden boy had been up to. The investigation was swift and thorough, aided by the photographs Troy had taken and the text messages I'd recovered from Julia's phone. Mark's security clearance was suspended pending the investigation. His promotion to major, which had been scheduled for that fall, was indefinitely postponed. The whispers started immediately. In the Army, reputation was everything, and Mark's was now radioactive. But that was just the beginning. Patricia also went after Julia's business. The corporate event planning industry in Austin was smaller than people realized, and reputation mattered there too. Word spread quickly about Julia's affair, helped along by strategic leaks to the right gossip networks. The Pemberton account, Julia's biggest client, dropped her after Mrs. Pemberton, a devoutly Catholic woman who took a dim view of infidelity, learned about the situation. 3 other major clients followed within a week. It's not personal, Patricia explained when I expressed some guilt about the collateral damage. It's business. Julia made choices, and choices have consequences. Meanwhile, I focused on the girls. Emma was struggling with the revelation about her paternity, acting out in ways that worried me. She'd started skipping classes, talking back to teachers, staying out past curfew. Zoe, whose paternity test had confirmed that she was also Mark's daughter, had become clingy and anxious, afraid that I was going to leave too. They need stability, the family therapist explained during one of our sessions. Their entire world has been turned upside down. The acting out is normal, but you need to be consistent with boundaries and expectations. Easier said than done when I was fighting my own battles with depression and rage. Some nights after the girls were asleep, I'd sit in my workshop and imagine all the ways I could make Mark and Julia pay. Most of them involved power tools and weren't legal. Troy kept me grounded during those dark weeks. You're winning, he reminded me during one of our regular check-ins. Julia's business is tanking, Mark's career is over, and you've got primary custody of the girls. Don't do anything stupid now. But I wasn't satisfied with just winning. I wanted them to understand what they'd cost me, what they'd cost Emma and Zoe. I wanted them to feel the same helpless rage I'd felt sitting in that diner looking at photographs of my wife in another man's arms. The opportunity came in October at my parents' house. My mother had called, insisting on a family dinner to work things out. She'd been in denial about the whole situation, convinced that it was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved with enough guilt and manipulation. Mark made a mistake, she'd said during one particularly painful phone call. But he's family, Dean. We have to forgive family. What about Julia? Is she family too? Julia was confused, vulnerable. You were working so much, never home. The blame, as always, somehow circled back to me. I almost didn't go to the dinner, but Emma convinced me. I want to see Uncle Mark, she said, and there was something in her voice I couldn't quite identify. I want to ask him some questions. So we went, Emma, Zoe, and I, to what would turn out to be the last Harlan family dinner. Julia was there when we arrived, sitting next to Mark on the couch like they belonged together. She looked thinner than I remembered, stressed in a way that expensive makeup couldn't quite hide. Mark was in civilian clothes, his usual confident demeanor slightly dimmed. "Girls!" my mother exclaimed, rushing to hug Emma and Zoe. "Oh, how I've missed you!" Emma submitted to the hug politely, but without enthusiasm. Zoe clung to my hand, suddenly shy around people who had been fixtures in her life just months before. Dinner was awkward from the start. My parents kept trying to pretend everything was normal, asking about school and work and the weather, while carefully avoiding any mention of the elephant in the room. Julia picked at her food and avoided eye contact with me. Mark kept glancing at Emma like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, Emma broke. "So," she said, setting down her fork and looking directly at Mark. "You're my biological father!" The silence that followed was deafening. "Emma," my mother started. "No, Grandma, I want to hear it from him!" Emma's voice was steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Are you my father?" Mark cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Biologically, yes. But Dean raised you and—" "Where were you?" Emma interrupted. "When I was learning to walk, where were you? When I had nightmares, who came to my room? When I broke my arm in second grade, who sat with me in the emergency room? Emma, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." Emma stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "You had an affair with my mom, got her pregnant, and then disappeared for 14 years. Now you want to play daddy because it's convenient." "That's not fair," Julia said, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived. "The situation was complicated." "Complicated?" Emma laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You cheated on Dad, with his brother, for 2 years. What's complicated about that?" "Emma, please," my mother tried again. "And you?" Emma turned to my parents, her young face blazing with righteous anger. "You knew, didn't you? You've always liked Uncle Mark better, and now you get to have him and Mom together, and Dad can just disappear. Is that what you want?" "Of course not," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then why are they here?" Emma gestured at Mark and Julia. "Why are we all sitting around pretending this is okay?" I watched my 14-year-old daughter, Mark's biological child but mine in every way that mattered, defend me with a ferocity that took my breath away. This girl who I'd worried might choose Mark over me was willing to take on the entire family for my sake. "Emma's right," I said quietly. "This isn't okay, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend it is anymore." I stood up, and Zoe immediately moved to my side. "Dean, please," my mother said. "We're family. We need to work this out." "No, Mom. We needed to work this out before Mark decided to sleep with my wife. We needed to work this out before Julia decided our marriage was disposable. We needed to work this out before you decided that keeping the family together was more important than what was right." I looked around the table at these people who had shaped my life, who I'd loved and trusted and tried so hard to please. "I'm done," I said, "with all of it. Emma, Zoe, we're leaving." "Dean, wait!" Mark stood up, reaching out like he was going to try to stop me. I turned to face him, and whatever he saw in my expression made him freeze. "You want to know what's not complicated, Mark? This. You destroyed my marriage, broke up my family, and hurt my children. And for what? So you could feel like the hero again? So you could take something that was mine? It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. And you know what the really pathetic part is? You could have had anyone. You're handsome, charming, successful. You could have found someone single, someone available. But that wouldn't have been enough, would it? You had to prove you could take something from me." Mark's face flushed red. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? Tell me, Mark, when did it start? When did you first look at my wife and decide you wanted her?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Mark's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "It was Emma's birthday party 3 years ago," Julia said quietly. "When you were working late and missed the cake." The memory hit me like a physical blow. Emma's 11th birthday, a job that had run long because of permit issues. Julia's cold anger when I'd finally made it home. I'd thought she was mad about the party. I'd never imagined she was already planning to replace me. 3 years, I said. 3 years of lies. "Dean, I'm sorry," Julia started. "No, you're not. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry it's messy. But you're not sorry it happened." I was right, and we both knew it. I gathered my daughters and headed for the door, leaving behind 20 years of family dinners and forced smiles, and trying to be good enough for people who would never see me as anything more than the consolation prize. In the car, Emma was quiet for a long time. "Dad?" she said finally. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "I'm glad you're my real father. Biology doesn't matter." I had to pull over because I couldn't see the road through my tears. 6 months after that final family dinner, I got the call I'd been waiting for. "It's over," Patricia said, her voice crisp with satisfaction. "Mark's been discharged from the Army. Conduct unbecoming an officer. He'll lose his pension, his benefits, everything." I was standing in the kitchen of the house I'd renovated with my own hands, watching Emma help Zoe with her homework at the table where we'd once been a family. The irony wasn't lost on me. What about Julia? Her business is finished. The last of her clients dropped her yesterday. Word is she's filing for bankruptcy. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I just felt tired. There's more, Patricia continued. Mark's trying to get visitation with the girls. He's claiming parental rights. The fatigue vanished, replaced by the familiar surge of protective rage. Over my dead body. That's what I told his lawyer. We'll fight it, of course, but Dean, he does have biological claim to both girls. He's a stranger to them. He's been in their lives for maybe 40 hours total since this whole thing started. I know, and that's our argument. But prepare yourself for a battle. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and watched my daughters, because that's what they were, biology be damned, work on math problems and spelling words. They looked settled, happy even, in a way they hadn't since before the divorce. Emma had started seeing a therapist who specialized in adolescents dealing with family trauma. Her grades had improved, and she'd stopped the rebellious acting out that had worried me so much. She was still my brilliant, stubborn girl, but the angry edge had softened. Zoe had taken longer to adjust, but she was getting there. She still had nightmares sometimes, still worried that I was going to leave like Mommy had, but the clingy anxiety was fading. She'd made friends at school, joined the art club, started laughing again. I wasn't about to let Mark disrupt that progress for the sake of his own guilt, or Julia's need to maintain the fantasy that they were good people who'd just made a mistake. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in March. Mark showed up in a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, accompanied by a lawyer who specialized in fathers' rights cases. He looked nervous but determined, like a man on a mission to redeem himself. Julia was there too, sitting in the back of the courtroom like she was afraid to get too close to the action. She'd lost weight since I'd last seen her, and her hair was shorter, less styled. She looked like a woman who'd been through hell, which I suppose she had. Patricia was ruthless. She presented evidence of Mark's abandonment of the girls, his complete absence from their lives, until his affair with Julia was discovered. She brought in testimony from Emma and Zoe's teachers, their therapists, their friends' parents, all of whom painted a picture of children who were thriving under my sole custody. She presented Mark's military discharge records, his conduct violations, his complete lack of stability or permanent address. She painted him as a man who destroyed a family and was now trying to claim the pieces out of guilt or selfishness. Mark's lawyer fought back, arguing that biology mattered, that Mark had a right to know his daughters, that I was being vindictive and using the children as weapons in my war against their biological father. He wasn't entirely wrong about the vindictive part. But then, Emma asked to speak to the judge. At 15, she was old enough to have her wishes considered in custody matters. She walked to the front of the courtroom with her shoulders back and her head high, looking more mature than she had any right to at her age. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and steady. I know Mark Harlan is my biological father. I've known for months, and I want you to know that it doesn't matter to me. The courtroom was dead silent. Dean Harlan is my dad, Emma continued. He's the one who taught me to ride a bike, who helped me with my science projects, who stayed up with me when I was sick. He's the one who's been there for every important moment of my life. She turned slightly to look at Mark, and I saw something in her expression that was both compassionate and implacable. I don't hate you, she said to him, but I don't know you either. You're a stranger who happens to share my DNA. That doesn't make you my father. Mark's face crumpled, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I understand that you might feel guilty about what happened, Emma continued. But disrupting my life and my sister's life isn't going to fix what you broke. We're happy now. We're stable. Please don't take that away from us. She returned to her seat next to me, and I squeezed her hand, overwhelmed with pride and love for this remarkable young woman who'd somehow grown up to be wiser than most of the adults in her life. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Mark's petition for visitation was denied. The court found that it would not be in the best interests of the children to disrupt their current stable living situation for the sake of a biological relationship that had never been established or maintained. Mark's lawyer immediately filed an appeal, but Patricia was confident it wouldn't succeed. The judge was right, she told me outside the courthouse. Biology isn't everything. Family is about more than DNA. That evening, I took the girls out to dinner to celebrate. Not the court victory, but the fact that we'd survived the last year intact. We went to their favorite Mexican restaurant, the one with the terrible mariachi music and the best queso in Austin. Dad? Zoe said as we were waiting for our food. Are you going to get married again? The question caught me off guard. I don't know, sweetheart. Why? Because I think you should. You're a good husband. Mom was just broken. The casual wisdom of a 10-year-old delivered over chips and salsa. Maybe someday, I said. But right now, I'm pretty happy with just you two. Emma smiled, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from her in months. We're pretty happy too. Later that night, after the girls were in bed, I sat in my workshop and thought about the last year. The betrayal, the anger, the legal battles, the slow process of rebuilding our lives from the wreckage of what we'd thought was our family. I thought about Mark and Julia, who'd gotten what they'd said they wanted, but had lost everything else in the process. Mark's military career was over, his relationship with his parents strained, his chance to be a real father to Emma and Zoe gone. Julia's business was ruined, her reputation destroyed, her children lost to her except for court-mandated visitation that they barely tolerated. They'd won each other, but the cost had been everything else that mattered. I thought about my parents, who'd chosen sides and chosen wrong, who now had to live with the knowledge that their favoritism had contributed to the destruction of their family. And I thought about Emma and Zoe, who'd been through hell but had come out stronger, who'd chosen love over biology, who taught me more about what family really meant than 20 years of marriage ever had. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my heart clenched, thinking it might be Julia or Mark, but it was from Troy. Beer tomorrow? I've got a new case that'll make you feel better about your life choices. I smiled and typed back, can't. Taking the girls to the lake. Rain check? Family man, came his response, followed by a smiley face emoji. Yeah, I thought, looking around at the home I'd built with my own hands, listening to the sounds of my daughters getting ready for bed upstairs. Family man. It had a nice ring to it. 2 years later, I was installing crown molding in a client's dining room when my phone rang. The number was one I hadn't seen in months, but I recognized it immediately. Mark. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. What do you want? I said without preamble. Dean. His voice sounded different, smaller somehow, less confident. I need to talk to you. We have nothing to talk about. It's about Julia. Something in his tone made me pause. I set down my nail tool and stepped outside onto the client's front porch. What about her? She's sick, Dean. Really sick, cancer. The words hit me like a physical blow. Whatever I'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. How sick? I asked, hating myself for caring. Stage 4. The doctors say, they say she has maybe 6 months. I sat down heavily on the porch steps, trying to process this information. Julia, who'd been the picture of health, who'd run marathons and done yoga and eaten organic everything. Julia, who was only 38 years old. She wants to see the girls, Mark continued. She's been asking for them. She has visitation rights. She can see them every other weekend. She's too sick for that now. She's in the hospital most of the time. Dean, please! She's dying! The plea in his voice was something I'd never heard from Mark before. This wasn't the confident golden boy who'd stolen my wife. This was a man who was watching the woman he'd destroyed his life for slip away. Let me think about it, I said finally. Dean, I said I'll think about it. I hung up and sat on the porch for a long time, watching traffic and trying to figure out what I felt. Anger, yes, but also something that might have been sadness. Not for the woman who'd betrayed me, but for the girl I'd fallen in love with in college. The one who'd existed before the lies and the affairs and the bitter custody battles. That night, I sat Emma and Zoe down and told them about their mother's illness. Emma, now 16 and somehow even wiser than she'd been at 15, took it with the kind of composure that broke my heart. How long does she have? She asked. Mark says 6 months, maybe less. Emma nodded, processing this information with the maturity that trauma had forced on her too young. I want to see her, she said finally. Are you sure? You don't have to. I'm sure. She's still my mother, even if she wasn't a very good one. Zoe, now 12 and old enough to understand and if not all its implications, was quieter about it. Will she hurt us again? She asked. No, sweetheart. She can't hurt us anymore. We went to the hospital the next Saturday. Julia was in a private room that Mark had probably paid for, surrounded by flowers and get-well cards that couldn't disguise the reality of what was happening to her. She looked terrible. The cancer had taken her hair, her weight, the vibrant energy that had once made her the center of every room she entered. But when she saw Emma and Zoe, her face lit up with something that looked like the woman I'd once loved. My girls, she whispered, reaching out with hands that were too thin, too fragile. Emma approached the bed first, cautious but not unkind. She let Julia take her hand, let her stroke her hair, let her say all the things she should have said 2 years ago when it might have mattered. Zoe hung back, staying close to me. She was polite but distant, treating Julia like a stranger who happened to know her name, which in many ways was exactly what Julia had become. I stayed for an hour, watching my daughters say goodbye to their mother, and felt nothing but a kind of hollow sadness for all the time that had been wasted, all the chances that had been missed. When we left, Julia caught my hand. "Dean," she said, her voice barely audible, "I'm sorry for everything. You were a good husband, and I was selfish." "Yeah," I said, "you were." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was just acknowledgement of what we both knew to be true. Julia died 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning while Emma was at school and Zoe was at soccer practice. Mark called to tell me, and I could hear him crying on the other end of the line. "The funeral is Friday," he said. "Will you bring the girls? If they want to come?" They did, of course. Whatever Julia had done, she was still their mother, and they needed to say goodbye properly. The service was small, just family and a few of Julia's remaining friends. Mark gave a eulogy that painted Julia as a woman who'd made mistakes, but had loved deeply. My parents were there, looking older and more frail than I remembered, unsure of how to navigate the complicated grief of losing someone who'd been both family and destroyer of family. Emma spoke too, reading a poem she'd written about forgiveness and letting go. There wasn't a dry eye in the church when she finished, including mine. At the graveside, after the service was over and people were starting to drift away, Mark approached me. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing them, for letting them say goodbye. They needed it. I know I have no right to ask this, but could I see them sometimes? Not as their father, just as, I don't know, someone who cared about their mother." I looked at this man who'd been my brother, my enemy, my rival, and saw only someone broken by loss and regret. "That's up to them," I said. "They're old enough to make their own choices about who they want in their lives." He nodded, accepting the boundary I'd drawn. Emma chose to see him occasionally, not as a father figure, but as someone who could tell her stories about her mother that I couldn't. Zoe was less interested, but she was polite when their paths crossed. Life settled into a new normal. I kept working, kept raising my daughters, kept building and fixing and creating something good from the wreckage of what we'd lost. Emma graduated high school with honors and got into UT on a partial scholarship. She wanted to study psychology, she said, to help other kids whose families had fallen apart. Zoe discovered a talent for art that reminded me painfully of Mark, but I encouraged it anyway because it made her happy. I started dating again, carefully and slowly. A woman named Sarah who taught at Zoe's school, who was kind and patient and understood that my daughters would always come first. We took it slow, building something real and honest and based on truth instead of lies. One evening, about 3 years after Julia's funeral, I was working late in my shop when Emma found me. "Dad," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever regret it? Fighting so hard to keep us?" The question surprised me. "Never. Why would you ask that?" "Because we're not really yours. Biologically, I mean. And you could have had a fresh start, found someone new, had kids of your own." I set down my tools and really looked at her. This young woman who'd grown up to be everything I could have hoped for in a daughter, who'd stood by me when the world fell apart, who'd chosen love over DNA. "Emma," I said, "you and Zoe are mine in every way that matters. You're mine because I chose you and you chose me. That's stronger than biology. That's family." She smiled, the same brilliant smile that had lit up my world since she was born. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart." After she went inside, I sat in my workshop and thought about the long, strange journey that had brought us here. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed us had, in the end, made us stronger. We'd learned what family really meant. Not the people you're related to, but the people who show up, who stay, who choose to love you even when it's hard. Mark had been right about one thing all those years ago. Family was everything. He'd just been wrong about which family mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Movie night tomorrow, I'll bring popcorn." I smiled and typed back, "Sounds perfect. The girls will love it." And they would. We'd built something good here, something real and lasting, something that couldn't be shaken by lies or betrayal or the complicated mess of human relationships. We'd built a family. Outside, the Texas night was warm and full of possibility. Inside, my daughters were doing homework and planning their futures and trusting me to keep them safe and loved. I'd spent years learning to fix other people's broken homes, But the most important thing I'd ever built was this family, this love, this choice to keep showing up even when everything fell apart. Mark and Julia had gotten what they thought they wanted, but they'd lost everything that actually mattered. They'd chosen passion over commitment, excitement over stability, the thrill of the forbidden over the quiet satisfaction of building something lasting. In the end, they'd had each other, but they'd had nothing else. I had everything else. And that, I realized, as I turned off the lights and headed inside to the people who mattered most, was exactly how it should be.